Hello and welcome back to another episode from the Winning Edge Talks podcast. This is Vishwanath, your host. I'm a sports mental conditioning coach, counselor, author, blogger, and podcaster. Dear listener, I love telling stories. Starting with this episode, I bring to you a series of stories on sports episode, especially on the mental side. So, sit back and enjoy listening. The topic of this episode is the success story of African runners. Close your eyes and imagine the lineup of the 100 meters men's finals of any Olympics. The picture of 8 colored men will come to your mind. Similarly, mention the term distance running. You will be reminded of an East African winning the race. The East Africans are so dominant in middle and long distance running that it is a foregone conclusion that one of them will win the race. They have also been excelling in marathons all over the world. These athletes hailing from African, Afro American, Afro-Saharan countries are usually of dark complexion and are referred to as blacks or colored athletes. For want of playing opportunities, these have migrated to many other countries across the globe. These athletes are usually tall, strong, lithe, or muscular bodied. There is a strong perception amongst us that these African athletes have a great genetic advantage and all the success they achieve comes from their physical attributes. Yes, in any physical sport, the physical attributes like height, strength, muscles, flexibility and stamina matters, as they give the athlete a distinct advantage over the others. But there is much more to it. These colored athletes have shown their superiority not just in athletics but also in sports like tennis, to name a few, the Williams sisters and Arthur Ashe, boxing, Muhammad Ali, Floyd Mayweather Jr., Mike Tyson, etc., basketball, Michael Jordan, and in golf, Tiger Woods. Who will forget the West Indies cricket team? But what has puzzled many is the dominance of the blacks, if I may be permitted to use the word, in sprinting and distance running. At least till a later part of the previous century, all races stood a chance in these events, but the chances have diminished. The blacks have dominated these events since many decades. Earlier, the whites and the Aryans were believed to be superior to the blacks in many ways, though now the Aryan is no longer considered a race. I will take you back to the Berlin Olympics in 1936, when Jesse Owens won 2 gold medals in the august presence of Adolf Hitler. Hitler refused to shake hands with Jesse Owens because an American black had won the gold medal. Hitler was of the firm belief that Aryans were superior to everyone. That was the beginning of the black dominance in sports. It was a question of their self-esteem and self-belief because until then they were treated as inferior to the whites, especially in their mental capacity and their intelligence. Back then, it was believed that blacks were physically superior because of a certain genetic makeup. It was in the 1970s, researchers started their experiments to find out if blacks had a different genetic makeup compared to the other races. In 1972, a young scientist named Richard Lewontin discovered that the vast majority of the genes present in the black athletes was pretty much the same for a vast majority of global population. If at all variation existed, then it was about 85% within the population groups and a mere 7% across races. So, the generalization that blacks had a superior genetic advantage was debunked. It remained a mystery as to what was the reason for the superiority of the blacks in running. By this time, it was well known that many of the elite distance runners of East African countries like Kenya and Ethiopia came from the Rift Valley, which was full of high altitude mountains. As far as Kenya was concerned, 75% elite long distance runners came from Iten and Eldoret, towns of Nandi district, which fell in the Rift Valley. They are called as the Nandi running tribe. The Rift Valley had number of ups and downs. It must be noted here that a majority part of the Rift Valley, especially the high altitude RC region, falls in Ethiopia, which is also the reason for the success of distance runners from Ethiopia. The success of distance runners is not restricted to the Ethiopians and the Kenyans. Even runners from Morocco and Algeria have found success in distance running because their geographical conditions are similar. A researcher named Yanis Pitsiladis decided to visit the Rift Valley and talk to as many elite distance runners and other experts as possible to explore the truth. Pitsiladis collected swabs of saliva samples from the elite runners for testing purpose and to compare the DNA. He even took the sample from Haile Gebrselassie, the man universally recognized as the greatest long-distance runner of all time. Pitsiladis also found that genetically there was not much difference of the Africans' DNA with the other races except deviations within the African racial groups. There was no evidence of superior genetics. During his many arduous visits to the Rift Valley, Pitsiladis gathered a lot of information with regard to the living conditions, social economic status of people who lived there. He had an inkling that these factors had a lot to do with the success of long-distance runners from these regions. Now, let's get down to the other reasons for the success of these runners. Firstly, the economic condition of most of the African countries was poor, and the public transport was virtually non-existent. Children had to run in excess of 20 kilometers to and from the school to pursue their education. Since they lived in high altitudes, they had to run each day to avoid being late to school. During the break, they even had to run home for lunch. Dear listeners, running on high altitude was the advantage they had that took them to the success in long distance running. As Haile Gebrselassie famously said, "For us, life was a kind of sport." Many young men and women had to run to far-off places on errands. On their way back home, they carried bundles of firewood or cans of water from the streams for their later use. Most elite East African runners running in altitudes in excess of 2000 meters at the rate of 15 kilometers per hour, covering 15 kilometers per day, would have clocked 6,000 hours by their 16th birthday and going on to complete 10,000 hours by the time they are grown-up adults. Remember what Malcolm Gladwell has said in his book Outliers. it takes 10 years or 10,000 hours of practice to attain mastery in anything. This explains the reasons for the success of East Africans in long distance running. Though many high altitude runners from places across the world have emerged, they could not taste the same amount of success because African runners have run consistently on high altitudes since childhood, and running was a necessity and a way of life for them. High altitude running helped the East African runners to improve their performance because the thin air at high altitudes forces the body to produce more oxygen carrying red blood cells, which in turn boosted endurance. In a research conducted by Professor Yang Saltin and colleagues, they found that East African children who ran to school as a means of transport had a maximum oxygen uptake, VO2 max, some 30% higher than the others who did not run to school. It was not their genes that gave them their aerobic advantage, it was their running. They were found to be possessing high hemoglobin and high hematocrit. They are able to sustain the highest fraction of VO2 max during long distance running. This gave them an enormous advantage while running at other parts of the world during the races, especially on flat surfaces. In lighter vein, many say running long distance races across the world is a cakewalk for these East African runners. Researchers found out that since these runners were poor, they could not afford a nutritious prescribed diet. They ate a staple diet that they were used to. It consisted of ugali, a thick corn meal porridge made from maize and corn, with few pieces of roasted meat, cooked vegetables, milk and small amounts of fruits. That is all they could afford. Many of the school-going children ran barefoot because they could not afford any footwear, let alone a running pair of shoes. As the international event ambassador of the Vedanta Delhi Half Marathon held at New Delhi recently on October 16th, Haile Gebrselassie, speaking to Times of India amongst many things, said, "I have been running since I was 4 or 5. My running began not for fun or competition, but as my daily activity. I ran to school and back, and after school I had to be back home in time to help my parents. After school you have to help in the field and everything as hard labor, the traditional way. There was no machinery. You even carried water home from the nearby river." When asked about his strange running style with his arms stuck at the side, he said, "Yes, if you watch the tapes of my races, mechanically my left hand is not active like the right one. The left one is crooked near the chest, like someone is carrying the books under the arm. Of course, when you go to school and you have to carry books, that's the way you run. It became that way even when I was running without books." In a TEDx talk given by Yanis Pitsilades at the University of Nicosia, this TEDx talk is there for everyone to see in the YouTube. Yanis shows a visual of Pemja Primary School perched high up on the mountains. After the regular dirt road ended, the kids had to climb 7 kilometers up to reach the school. It is not necessary for me to explain any more about the hardship children go through for their education in this part of the world and how their bodies get trained automatically in the process. Before I proceed to the success story of the sprinters from Western Africa, I want to mention some of the names of great distance runners from East Africa who have won prizes and medals at World Championships, Olympics and marathons all over the world. Eliud Kipchoge, Abebe Bikila, Kenenisa Bekele, Wilson Kipsang Kiproti, Paul Tergat, Dibaba sisters and many others. I beg to be forgiven if I have left some of very big names in this sport. Now the question on why East Africans are such good distance runners. Though the black population is widely distributed in West Africa and other parts of the world, the reason for the success of many distance runners coming from the Rift Valley region is the popularity of the sport in this region, the high altitude training they get, and the inspiration they draw from their previous heroes who have excelled in distance running. The success of the previous heroes and their prosperity gave them the hope that they could make a life out of running. Now, let's move on to the success of the colored sprinters. The runners from West African countries have been traditionally known for their success in sprinting in all international events. But this success rate is not found with the sprinters from some other Western countries which are their neighboring countries, though many of them are black. Why is it so? Matthew Syed, the author of Bounds, How Champions Are Made, writes in the chapter, Are Black Superior Runners? He writes, but not even this West African success is quite what it seems. Many of these world-beating performances are limited to two population groups, African Americans and Jamaicans. Just like it happened with distance runners coming from Rift Valley of Ethiopia and Kenya, isn't it? It is true that both these groupings, the Afro Americans and Jamaicans, have Western American ancestry, but it makes no sense to describe their success in sprinting as a West African trait. These runners also came from specific region which had a predominant population of sprinters. People once again said sprinters from West African countries had a racial genetic superiority, which was proved wrong once again. During the research, researchers stumbled upon the presence of a gene called ACTN3, which is associated with fast twitch muscle fibers that assist explosive running, which we commonly refer to as instant acceleration with bursts of speed. It was soon discovered that this too was not the reason for the success of sprinters from Afro American countries and Jamaica especially. Though 98% of Jamaicans had the ACTN3 gene, so did the Europeans and the Kenyans. And as you know, Kenyans have always been good at long distance running and not sprinting. In the absence of the concrete genetic proof to explain the sprinting success, researchers, like they did with long distance runners, turned towards cultural factors to explain Jamaican success in sprinting. Like in the case of distance runners and marathoners from East Africa, who inspired the youth to take up distance running, this breed of speed merchants from Western African countries, mainly Afro American countries and the Jamaicans, inspired the youth to pursue sprinting and making a career out of it. These runners gave hope to the youth that if practiced diligently, running would become a vehicle to drive them out of their poverty towards prosperity. The names of these famous sprinters from Jamaica comes to my mind: Usain Bolt, Shelly Ann Fraser-Pryce, and Asafa Powell. There are many other sprinters who have brought repute to Afro America and Jamaica. Matthew Syed, the author, states, "The sporting success of Africans and Afro Americans is the consequence not of genetics, but of unequal opportunities and barriers to make an entry into the other spheres of economic life. It is the reason blacks are driven into professional sport. The reason we see so many colored athletes take up various sports and succeed in it is because in most cases they see sport as a career that would bring them out of poverty and discrimination, that would give them the social justice and equality in the eyes of the world. They cling on to this necessity with their dear life and put in the hard work and sacrifice needed to reach success. Let's pay growing tribute to the greatest black athletes of all time: Usain Bolt, Jesse Owens, Wilma Rudolph, Carl Lewis, Raymond Gray, Donovan Bailey, Alison Felix, Gabriel Thomas, Delilah Muhammad, Jackie Joyner-Kersee, and definitely many others. The secret of success of African origin runners does not lie in their genes or their natural ability. It lies in their need to excel and survive, and in the effort and sacrifice they make towards this end. Dear listener, this is Vishwanath signing off for Winning Edge Talks podcast.